To the Vikings, love was a bargain, sex was power, and marriage was a contract written in bone and blood. Behind the clash of swords and the thunder of longships skimming across black seas, there were softer truths whispered into firs by hearthlight. There were runes scratched onto driftwood, hidden beneath floorboards, or carried close to the heart, where only the lover and the gods would know. They wrote sagas of heroes and monsters, but in the quiet spaces between battles, they told stories of the ones who waited, the ones who mourned, the ones who found warmth where they could, and vanished into the snow when the price of staying became too high. What did love truly mean to a people who worshipped Freya, goddess of fertility and fierce desire, who poured out mead to gods of harvest and war in the same breath, who sang to the land to bring crops, but kept a blade ready for the neighbor who might come for them first? Tonight, we begin not with a raid or the roar of oars striking salt water, but with a quiet bargain struck on a winter's night. A girl no older than 15 sits on a carved bench beside a smoking hearth, her hair bound in tight braids laced with bits of copper wire. Her mother runs calloused fingers through the girl's hair one last time, murmuring old words to keep her safe, though everyone in the room knows safety is not something a promise can truly give. Outside, a thin moon hangs over snow-crusted fields where cattle stand in the cold, waiting for the spring grass that might never come. Inside, the father talks of land boundaries and dowries. A young man kneels by the fire, shifting his weight from knee to knee, wondering if the price he's offered will buy him the daughter's hand or bring the family's anger down on his kin forever. At the far end of the longhouse, a boy watches them through the smoke. Younger brother, cousin, future witness to what happens when the words are spoken, and the bride is led from one hearth to another. He wonders if she loves the man kneeling before her father. He wonders if she ever will. For the Vikings, love alone rarely chose a spouse. Marriage was a promise that rippled through entire clans. It bound farms together, joined bloodlines, settled feuds. It was cattle, silver, grain, and sometimes a good sword to seal the deal. A bride brought linen and milk cows. A groom brought protection, and the unspoken threat that if harm came to his wife, he'd answer it with blood. Yet for all these bargains struck over horns of ale, there were other unions whispered about in the dark corners of the hall. Lovers who met in haylofts and behind turf walls. Wives who gave birth to children whose fathers had sailed south seasons before and never returned. Husbands who claimed kinship to a child whose eyes told a different story. In the sagas, these secrets are footnotes, small lines that slip between pages of battle and vengeance. But in the real longhouses, they were truths carried like coals in the palm, easy to hide, quick to burn. Some men carved their lovers' names into the wooden beams of their ships, hidden beneath tar and pitch. Some women tied charms into their husbands' clothes to keep them faithful, though the gods knew better than to promise such things. A Viking could vanish for years, raiding along the coasts of Francia or guarding a distant king for silver. When he returned, he might find his farm thriving under his wife's rule, or find another man's boots by his hearth. Some forgave, some did not. So what did love mean in a world that demanded loyalty from your sword first, your heart second? It meant a promise as fragile as a birch bark letter hidden in a sleeve. It meant a feast that could end in song or steel. It meant children named for gods, raised to believe they too would stand strong in the storm, and maybe die before they could grow old together. Tonight, we stand at the edge of that world. We walk the frost-cracked earth where men swore oaths under watchful eyes, and women carried secrets in their bloodline that no rune could spell out clearly. We listen to the crackle of fire on ancient hearthstones. We hear the quiet breath of a young bride wondering if her new husband's hand will be gentle or hard. In the cold glow of the north, love could mean a gift of land, a handful of silver, a wedding ring hammered from iron, worn thin by years of chopping wood and hauling nets. It could mean waiting by the shore each dusk, scanning the horizon for sails that might never come. And when the longship returned, or did not, the saga continued. Some marriages grew into true bonds, strong enough to stand the storms. Some shattered, leaving only songs of betrayal and revenge to echo through the halls. For the Vikings, love was never just love. It was kinship, alliance, survival, a promise spoken in front of kin and clan, a debt owed to the gods, a memory written into the bones of old warriors long buried beneath moss and stone. So we ask again, what did it mean to love in an age where loyalty could be bought, but the heart could not be chained? What did it mean to promise yourself to one person when the sea forever called your name? Tonight, we uncover those truths, hidden behind shield walls and whispered in bedchambers lit by oil lamps. We follow the runes, the rings, the stories left behind. And in their echoes, we find a kind of love no contract could truly hold, and no sword could ever cut clean away. When we imagine a Viking wedding, we might picture flower crowns, roaring feasts, and lovers clasping hands under the watchful gaze of the gods. But beneath the ale horns and the laughter was a colder truth. Marriage was never just about the two who shared a bed. It was about fields and fences, cattle and kin, survival stitched together with vows no sweeter than a sword's edge. A father's wealth was measured not just in silver or slaves, but in how wisely he wed his children. A daughter was a promise to expand the farm's reach, to settle feuds, to bind old enemies by blood so their blades stayed sheathed. A son's marriage might bring new grazing land, a foothold in another fjord, a way to hold the family's power together when storms rose and tempers flared. These unions did not begin with stolen glances or shy courtship. They began at long tables where men leaned over carved boards, tracing out the borders of pastures that would change hands with a bride. They began with the munder, the bride price, silver or livestock given by the groom's family to prove the match was fair, and the husband had the means to keep his new wife fed and clothed. This was not a gift, but a guarantee. The bride brought her own promise too, the heimanfylgja, her dowry. This might be a chest of fine cloth, a string of beads from distant traders, a few cows to keep the household fed through the long dark months. Sometimes it was land passed down by her mother's line, a strip of meadow, a grove of birch, her own inheritance to carry into a new life. Together, the munder and the heimanfylgja formed a bond stronger than words alone. If the husband died, the wife often kept her dowry. If he mistreated her, she might return to her kin with her wealth intact. Though the cost of such freedom could be steep in a world where reputations were guarded like gold. And yet, within these hard bargains, some found power that would surprise us now. Take Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, Gudrid the far traveler, whose life was a saga written across oceans. She was born on the cold edge of Iceland where the wind cut through turf walls like a knife. Her first marriage bound her to the son of Eric the Red, the man who carved out the first farms in Greenland's frozen coast. When her husband died, Gudrid did not fade into widowhood. She remarried, another strategic match that took her further still. With her second husband, Gudrid crossed the sea again, sailing to the shores of Vinland, what we now call North America, where she gave birth to a son beneath foreign stars. Her marriages stitched settlements together from Iceland to Greenland to the wild edge of the New World. Her name is still spoken because she understood what the bride price could buy. Not just a home or a place by a fire, but the chance to shape a people's story. For some Viking men, one wife was not the limit of their ambition. A wealthy chieftain might take another if he could afford the cost. More cattle, more land, more sons to swing swords in his name. Yet the first wife often remained the keeper of his hall and his honor. Inside the turf walls, it was she who counted the grain, brewed the ale, ordered the thralls, and kept the farm alive while her husband vanished for seasons at sea. It was she who unlocked the storeroom keys from her belt and passed them to the next in line when the time came. A wedding was not a single night of song and feasting, though the feasts were real enough, with roasted lamb and honeyed mead and scalds, chanting tales of old heroes, until dawn's pale light crept under the eaves. The real ceremony lay in the gifts exchanged under watchful eyes. A sword for the groom, a ring of iron or silver for the bride, sometimes keys, hung from her belt to mark her new domain. These were not just tokens, they were symbols of power, trust, and obligation. A sword meant protection, keys meant the right to command the household's wealth. When the couple stood together by the hearth, palms joined above a slaughtered horse, or beneath an image of Thor or Freya, they pledged not only loyalty to each other, but to the kin who stood behind them. They promised to bind their fates so tightly that any betrayal would tear entire families apart. And yet, for all its calculation, Viking marriage was not without tenderness. Many sagas hint at bonds that softened over time, where a wife's counsel shaped a husband's next voyage, or a husband's return brought more joy than all the silver in his chest. Still, love alone rarely won the match. A girl might dream of a neighbor's son who carved her name into his knife handle. But when her father called her to the long table, the words spoken there held more weight than any secret kiss. A man might come home from raiding rich with plunder and find his father had promised him to the daughter of an old ally he'd never met. To refuse was to break the chain that held farms and families together. Few dared. Sometimes these bargains led to quiet contentment. Two people learning to share a roof, a bed, a winter's silence. Sometimes they ended in bitterness, or in blood when oaths were broken, and a family's honor demanded payment in steel. Yet through it all, the rules were clear. The marriage bed was part of the battlefield that kept a clan alive. Cattle and land changed hands. Sons and daughters were born to carry old grudges and new dreams. And when the feast was done and the songs faded into snoring guests curled on benches, the newlyweds stepped into the dark, their futures locked by the bargain their elders had struck. In this world, a wedding was less a fairy tale than a carefully weighted gamble. Fathers wagered cattle, mothers offered dowries, young men pledged swords, and young women traded their names for new ones, hoping that behind the cold arithmetic, warmth might grow. So when we look back on the Vikings, we see more than warriors with axes and shields. We see families bound by promises hammered out like iron, promises that might hold through famine and storm, through betrayal and homecoming, through seasons when love was all that made the bargain worth the cost. For all their iron-bound codes of honor, the Vikings were a people who knew how to bend the world to fit harsh truths. And perhaps nowhere was this clearer than in the rights their women carried, like hidden blades beneath fine wool cloaks. Unlike so many corners of medieval Europe, where a woman's worth was sealed away with her dowry and her voice muffled by church and custom, in the Viking world, the law gave her tools sharp enough to cut free when needed. She was no mere ornament draped at her husband's side. She was keeper of the keys and keeper of her own escape. Picture a farm on a frost-bitten fjord, where turf walls groan under snow, and the hearth burns low through the endless night. In that small, tight world, it was the wife who counted the cheese rounds and salted fish, who weighed out the silver beads hidden in wooden chests. The ring of keys at her belt did more than lock storerooms. It unlocked her claim to the wealth she helped grow. A Viking woman could own land outright. She might inherit her father's ship if she was strong enough to hold it. And when a marriage soured, when bruises bloomed like frostbite under her sleeves, or when the man she called husband drank away the cattle she brought to his hall, she could stand before witnesses and speak a simple truth. I divorce thee. No priest, no crawling to a bishop's feet, no cloistered court where men judged whether her pain was enough to matter. She needed only her voice and the eyes of her kin to bear witness. In the sagas, these stories live on like flickers of candlelight in a dark longhouse. There was Un Ketilsdottir, called Un the Deep-Minded, a name that rang colder and clearer than any blade. When her husband died, a chieftain whose ships once crossed storm-split seas, she did not fade behind the veil of a widow's black. She took his fleet for her own. She gathered her kin, slaves, and loyal followers, and set her prow westward into the unknown. She crossed the North Atlantic's merciless bite and carved out her own corner of Iceland, a settlement bearing her name. Un did not just survive, she ruled. She granted land to her grandsons, brokered marriages like a king, and when she died, she was laid to rest in a ship burial, a queen in all but title. Her saga reminds us, in a world where most women's names dissolved into dust, some Viking women wrote theirs in stone. It was not always blood and defiance. Sometimes the path to freedom was far quieter. A woman packing her dowry back into its chest, lifting her keys from their hook, and leaving her husband's hall for her father's farm. If her kin were strong, they'd shelter her. If they were weak, the price of her freedom might be paid in spilled blood on a cold morning. The laws carved into rune-covered stones and inked onto vellum made her rights clear. A husband who struck his wife risked her departure and the loss of the wealth she carried away. A husband who failed to provide food and warmth in winter's grip could watch his home empty overnight. The same oath that bound her to his hearth gave her power to walk away from it. No church bells tolled for Viking weddings, and none tolled for Viking divorces either. There was no shame whispered behind closed doors, no sin for a woman who took her fate back into her own hands. To the Norse mind, honor was not blind obedience but fair dealing. If a bargain was broken, there was no virtue in staying chained. And so the sagas tell us of women who refused to bow, of wives who packed up with sharp tongues and sharper wits, who brought new matches to the long tables of their kin and wed again if it suited them. Sometimes love grew where the first match had withered. Sometimes it was strategy, plain and cold. For the Vikings, marriage was no fairy tale, but nor was divorce a curse. It was a balancing scale, weighed by cattle, keys, and kinship. A man who failed in his duty lost more than a wife. He lost the alliances she carried, the respect she commanded, the wealth she protected. Contrast this for a heartbeat with the hidden world of Yoshiwara, the pleasure district on the far side of the world, where women's beauty was bought and sold under lantern light. There, a courtesan could dream of freedom but rarely claim it. Her debts chained her tighter than iron shackles, her only hope the mercy of a patron who might buy her out, or the whisper of escape behind paper screens. In Yoshiwara, a woman's body was a contract signed by men who called themselves patrons. In the Viking North, a woman's body and her mind were both bound to her husband by law. But if he betrayed her trust, she could stand in the doorway of his hall and break that contract with her own breath. This was the quiet power behind the clatter of keys at a Viking woman's hip, the knowledge that within the turf walls and the smoky longhouse shadows, she was never wholly at the mercy of the man who shared her bed. And so when we speak of Viking love, we must speak also of Viking leaving, of women who turned away from fists and broken promises, of daughters who claimed fields for themselves, of widows who launched ships into unknown seas, of matriarchs who died with runes carved for them because they bent no knee to any man. It is easy to see the sagas only in swords and raids, but listen closely, and you'll hear the footsteps of women moving through snow, keys clinking at their belts, voices strong enough to break the silence of centuries. If marriage was a contract and divorce a blade, then sex for the Vikings was the living breath between. It was not something hidden in locked chambers or bound up in shame. To them, flesh and desire were threads spun by the gods themselves, sacred, wild, and sometimes dangerous. Their myths dripped with longing and ripe harvests, with fertility goddesses crowned in flowers and boars roaming fields heavy with grain. Freyr, the Shining One, was a god of sunlight and seed, of swelling fields and swelling bellies. His sister Freya, goddess of love, war, and gold, carried men's dreams in the sway of her hips and the sharp steel of her falcon cloak. To worship Freya was to know that love could heal or ruin. She was prayed to for passion, for childbirth, for the secret power of seduction. Her name was carved onto amulets worn under tunics, whispered into the wind before battles and bedding alike. In this world, a girl's virginity held worth, a mark of her father's honor, her family's standing, her marriage price at its highest. Yet once that veil was lifted, once she crossed the threshold from maiden to wife, sex was no sin to hide. Lovers met in haylofts, on ships rolling with the tide, in forests thick with pine and secrecy. Unlike later Christian Europe, the Vikings did not weave endless guilt into flesh. A man or woman might tumble together under furs, and if no bond was broken, no marriage betrayed, there was no priest to condemn them, no church to force penance on knees scrubbed raw. But honor always lurked like a wolf at the door. A woman's worth could be ruined by rumor if her father's trust was broken, if a tryst stained a marriage bargain yet to be sealed, and if a married man's passion strayed too far, if children came from a bed that was not his wife's, blood feuds could follow like storms rolling down a fjord. They did not fear the body, but they feared shame. And so, behind the carved doors of the longhouse, magic offered its own hidden justice. Seder, the old Norse art of weaving the unseen. To some, it was women's work, the spindle and chant. To others, dangerous, unmanly. For a man to wield Seder was to risk mockery, for it blurred the lines of the masculine and the wild feminine force that magic required. Yet still they did. Men and women alike turned to runes and whispered curses when love soured. A scorned wife might bury a carved charm beneath her rival's doorstep. A spurned lover might summon sickness or misfortune with a spell muttered into the wind. There were love spells too, sweet and sinister at once, to bind a heart that wandered, to open a body to desire, to force the hand of fate when a promise faltered. Their sagas are thick with these tales, doomed love tangled in pride and poetry, curses thrown like knives across windswept fields. They tell of Cormac the poet, who carved verses for Steingard, his heart's ruin. His poems bound them closer than any vow, yet pride and ill luck poisoned the bond. A witch's curse turned promise to ash. Every meeting drove them further apart. Every word of longing struck through with sorrow. They might lie together once more, lovers beneath the ghostly shimmer of the northern lights. But the sagas remind us, fate was a net even the fiercest hearts could not cut. And so sex among the Norse was life itself, the planting of seed, the risking of scandal, the chanting of spells in moonlight. Love could be a gift, freely given, or a weapon wielded behind closed doors. It was never fully tame. It slipped through law codes and bargains, tangled in the hair of young men who left home with a promise and returned with another woman's child. It shaped vendettas and lineages alike. And if the marriage bed was a contract, the secret bed was a battlefield of its own. To the Vikings, love was rarely simple. It was a saga written not only on stone, but in whispers and sweat, in poems hidden under cloaks, in runes carved on driftwood, set adrift on a tide only the gods could turn. If love was the spark, then betrayal was the wildfire that could consume entire clans. Among the Vikings, honor was not some delicate ornament. It was the bedrock of family, wealth, and survival itself. And when love tangled with betrayal, the cost was often paid in blood and ruin. A marriage joined two families, yes, but it also tied every brother, uncle, and cousin into a single fragile pact. And when that pact cracked, the feud that followed could roar across generations, like a winter storm that refused to die. Infidelity was not just a private shame, it was an insult, a stain on the name a man passed to his sons and daughters. If a wife strayed, her husband could drag the matter before the law court, the thing, to demand silver for his humiliation, or the right to strike the rival down where he stood. Sometimes he would spare the lover and drive the unfaithful wife away, stripping her of her dowry, casting her out into the cold world where no honest man would take her in. But sometimes, a slight could not be washed away with coin or banishment. Then came the feud, a grim dance of retribution where blades spoke louder than words. The sagas hold these tragedies like jewels buried in frost. They tell us of families torn apart by pride and passion, of alliances undone by a single night behind shuttered doors. One of the most haunting is the tale of Hallgerdur Langbrock, Hallgerd Longlegs, whose beauty was matched only by her fierce will. In Jarl's saga, Hallgerdur is a woman born to wealth and ambition, married more than once, each time pushing against the walls the world built for her. She did not submit easily. When her third husband, the wise and steady Gunnar Hamundarson, tried to curb her defiance, the clash of their pride echoed through the fjords. Hallgerdur harbored old grudges like embers she refused to let die. She baited men to acts of petty vengeance, sparked fires in places meant to stay dark. Once when Gunnar asked her to spare their stores during a siege, to cut her golden hair so he could restring his bow and defend their homestead, she refused, her spite greater than her fear. It cost him his life. Enemies broke through the doors while he fought with a bow that could not bend. Hallgerdur's cold pride sealed Gunnar's doom, and so her name entered the saga as a warning. In a world where loyalty was currency, betrayal could bankrupt an entire bloodline. Elsewhere, betrayal did not wait for marriage vows to sour. Young warriors and proud wives were caught up in love triangles that ended in ship burnings, ambushes at icy river crossings, poison slipped into drinking horns. One man's passion for another man's wife could spark a feud that rolled across farms and fjords, claiming cattle, kin, and coin until the debts were too deep for any law to settle. A woman might find herself the prize in a grudge match, taken, reclaimed, taken again, her children born into bitterness, their futures bound up in old blood debts. Yet even in these tangled knots of betrayal and revenge, the sagas never paint their people as monsters without hearts. Love, when it came, was real, fierce, poetic, blinding. But so was loyalty to clan, duty to kin, the iron weight of honor that could not be betrayed without consequence. A man might weep for the woman he lost, and still swing his sword at her new lover's throat. A wife might mourn her fallen husband, and quietly wed the very man who killed him, binding feud to feud until the gods themselves seemed to look away. In the Viking world, betrayal was never just a broken promise between two hearts. It was the shattering of the fragile bridge that connected families, neighbors, entire settlements. And when that bridge fell, it often took a generation to rebuild, if it was ever rebuilt at all. So they carved these stories into saga and song, warnings carried through the centuries like ghosts, whispering beneath sod roofs. Guard your heart, guard your kin, for the price of passion unpaid is often paid in blood. In the end, love could bind a people together, but betrayal and revenge reminded them that the same flame which warmed the hearth could also burn it to ash. If youth was a currency in the Viking world, then age was its quiet treasury, a store of wisdom, secrets, and stories earned through endurance. A girl might be wed off at 15, traded for land and cattle, her dowry folded into a clan's future. But should she outlive her husband, and many did, with men lost to feuds, disease, or the sea, she did not vanish into shadows, as so many women did in medieval Europe. Among the Vikings, Widowhood was not always a sentence. Sometimes it was a second chance. A widow could remarry quickly, sealing new alliances with her family's approval. To remain unmarried for too long was to risk vulnerability. A farm left exposed, children without protection, property claimed by distant male kin. Yet many widows turned this liminal space to their advantage. An older woman, seasoned by loss and survival, could wield surprising authority within her household and clan. No longer bound by the rules that hemmed in young brides, she might oversee estates, manage labor, settle disputes, even serve as foster mother to younger relatives, shaping the next generation. Keys were more than symbols, they were tools of power. A widow with keys commanded the household wealth, livestock, silver, the storehouses that meant life through winter. While her sons or male kin hunted or raided, she balanced the books, directed servants, bartered cloth, and cured meat at seasonal markets. Some went further still. The sagas remember women who stepped beyond the hearth and into legend. Take Aud the deep-minded, Un in the old tongue, one of the most revered foremothers of Iceland. Born into a powerful Norwegian family, Aud's life was marked by upheaval. When her husband, Olaf the White, a warlord in Dublin, was slain, she did not meekly retreat behind a male guardian. Instead, Aud built a ship in secret, gathering her kin and loyal followers. She crossed the sea like any chieftain might, landing on Iceland's raw shores and claiming land as her own. There, she parceled out property to her children and freedmen, guided settlements, and presided over feasts with the authority of a matriarch whose will could not be questioned. Even her burial was a statement. Unlike many women who faded nameless into grave mounds, Aud was laid to rest seated upright in a burial mound, facing the sea she once commanded, a ruler, even in death. Women like Aud remind us that the Viking world, for all its harshness, offered a kind of resilience to those who could seize it. In Christian Europe, a widow might be shuffled into a convent, hidden behind stone walls. In Viking lands, a clever, determined woman could carve a place for herself in law and memory alike. The sagas ripple with the names of such women, grandmothers, wise women, vulvas who read the threads of fate, and matriarchs whose voices carried more weight than any young bride's dowry. They remind us that age did not strip a Viking woman of her worth. If anything, it distilled it into sharp wisdom, cunning alliances, and a legacy that outlived the fires of her hearth. When the wind howled down the longhouse beams, it was often the elder woman who decided what stories were told, which secrets were kept, and who would inherit the keys when she was gone. In the end, the Vikings carved their laws not just on stones, but in memory. And woven into those memories are the quiet reigns of women who knew how to endure storms, bury their dead, and rise again with the dawn. In the Viking world, love did not stop where the heartbeat faltered. Death was a passage, not an end. And in that twilight realm, bonds of passion and kinship slipped their earthly chains to echo in saga and soil alike. When a man or woman died, the community gathered under the same heavy sky that had watched their feasts and feuds. Funerals were no mere farewells. They were transactions between this world and the next, where memory and legacy were sealed with fire, earth, and ship. Sometimes, if the bond was strong enough, two lovers crossed that threshold side by side. Graves from the Viking Age speak of couples buried together, their bones interlaced in postures that mimic an embrace. One such grave, unearthed in Sweden, held a man and woman laid together for over 1,000 years, surrounded by their daily treasures, iron keys, bronze brooches, rings for binding hair and cloaks, tools of their trade, tokens of their union. Even in death, the Viking mind was practical. Grave goods were more than offerings to the dead. They were provisions for the next life. A husband might hold his sword, ready to guard his wife in the realm beyond. A wife's keys might be laid across her chest, a sign that even in the shadowed halls of the dead, she kept the household's soul. Together, they stepped into the unknown, prepared to keep what they'd built in this world alive in the next. And when the dead deserved something grander than a mound of dirt, the Vikings gave them ships, vessels carved and tarred to withstand more than ocean storms. A ship burial was no small gesture. It was an act of power and devotion. A chieftain might lie in his dragon-proud longship, his weapons laid at his side, his animals sacrificed to serve him anew. Yet sometimes, these ships held not just warriors, but the ones who waited at home, husbands and wives, lovers who refused to be parted. They would sail together into the realm of the dead, their bodies cradled by planks that had once split waves, now splitting the veil between life and the afterlife. Fire too was a gate. On a fjord's frozen edge, a funeral pyre might burn long into the dark, embers spiraling into the night sky like 1,000 whispered prayers. Ashes mingled with the wind, carrying names and promises into legend. To stand at such a pyre was to know that love did not dissolve with flesh. It transformed, fueled by memory and myth. Above these mortal rituals hovered the gods, watching, weighing, and none stood closer to this mingling of passion, death, and rebirth than Freya. Goddess of love and beauty, yes, but also of battle and death. It was said that when warriors fell in glorious combat, half their souls went to Odin's hall, Valhalla, where they drank and trained for Ragnarok. But the other half? Freya claimed them for her own hall, Folkvanger, a softer, stranger place where the fallen might rest under her watch. There, under Freya's gaze, the warrior and his beloved might find one another again, no longer bound by clan feuds or debts owed. For Freya herself embodied that tension, fierce in love, fearless in war. She rode a chariot drawn by cats, wore the cloak of a falcon, and wept tears of red gold for her lost lover, Odur, who vanished for years at a time. The myths remind us that to the Vikings, love was never separate from the harsh truths of life. It grew among bargains and betrayal, bloomed in the shadows of swordplay, and found sanctuary in the halls of the gods. Love could be an oath sworn on a blade or a secret rune scratched into a piece of driftwood, cast into the sea in hopes it would find its way back. And when the breath left the body, the stories did not fade. They anchored themselves in burial mounds on windswept hills, in runestones that mark forgotten lovers and families who braved the wide sea together. To stand today among these stones, to run your fingers over the runes that curl like secret messages, is to feel the echo of that old understanding. That love, sex, and marriage were never only of this world. They were strands in a larger weave, the loom of fate spun by the Norns, the blessings whispered by Freya, the sacrifice made when one life bound itself to another. Sometimes, in the damp earth of Scandinavia or the wild heaths of Iceland, archaeologists still find them. The double burials, the ship burials, the ash and silver, the sword and the key. Evidence of the simple truth the Vikings knew too well, that to love was to risk, to lose, and to hope that in some other hall, on some other shore, your beloved waited with a hearth fire burning. And so when the last rune was carved, the last saga sung, and the funeral flames died to embers, the Vikings left us a legacy written in bone and ash, a promise that love's domain stretches beyond the grave, where the long ships sail forever into the dusk. Perhaps that is why we still speak their names. The warriors and their wives, the poets and their muses, because in the end, they taught us that the strongest bonds are forged not only by iron and blood, but by the stories we tell when the wind howls through the barrow mounds and the world goes quiet enough to remember. For the Vikings, love was rarely soft. It was a promise forged in hardship, a price paid in silver, cattle, blood. It was a sword laid across an oath ring, a whispered vow before the sea swallowed a longship's sail. They carved runes for each other under storm-gray skies, wrote verses for the ones they lost when winter or war claimed what they could not keep. They wove family ties as strong as iron, yet brittle as bone when betrayal split them apart. And yet, in the sagas and the graves they left behind, something endures. A reminder that even in a brutal world of cold seas and burning halls, the bonds we make outlive us all. They cross oceans, they whisper through soil, they linger in the stories we tell by firelight when night feels longest. A bride's keys, a lover's poem, a warrior's sword, all tokens that love and power, risk and devotion were never truly separate. They knew what we sometimes forget, that love can be duty, and duty can be sacrifice, and the price is worth paying if your name, and theirs, is spoken long after the last torch has guttered out. What about you? If you stood in a smoky longhouse, oath ring in hand, would you bind yourself to Viking love, or run for the dark forest where no promise could find you? Let me know in the comments, and if you want to follow more lost worlds of passion, power, and the ghosts we've left behind, subscribe now. There's another saga waiting, and next time, we'll open the door together.